The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, and I knew before opening it that Deborah Patterson, president of the Sunrise Ridge Homeowners Association, had found something new to complain about. I stood in my driveway in Henderson, Nevada, staring at the official seal on the envelope while sweat dripped down my back in the 100-degree heat. My name is Gregory Evers, and I had lived in this development for 15 years, long before most of these people even knew Sunrise Ridge existed. The letter was exactly what I expected: a fine for $500 and a demand to remove my vegetable garden within 14 days or face additional penalties of $100 per day. I looked at my backyard, visible from where I stood. Rows of tomatoes, peppers, squash, and beans grew in neat raised beds. Everything was organized, healthy, and productive. The garden took up maybe a quarter of my half-acre lot, positioned in the back corner where it barely visible from the street. I had built the beds myself, using cedar planks, and the whole setup looked cleaner than half the lawns in the neighborhood. The letter cited Section 12, Paragraph 4 of the HOA covenants. No structures or plantings shall be maintained that detract from the aesthetic uniformity and property values of the community. Aesthetic uniformity. I read those words 3 times, feeling my blood pressure rise. I had started the garden 6 months ago after retiring from my job as a civil engineer. My wife had passed away 2 years prior, and the garden gave me something to focus on besides an empty house. Nobody had said anything for half a year. Now, suddenly, it was an emergency requiring immediate action and a hefty fine. I walked into my house and grabbed my phone. My daughter, Sarah, answered on the second ring. "Dad, what is up? I just got fined by the HOA for my garden." "The vegetable garden? Are you kidding me?" $500, plus they want it gone in 2 weeks. Sarah knew how much the garden meant to me. She had helped me build the first raised bed, getting splinters and sunburned in the process. That is ridiculous. Can they even do that? According to their interpretation of the covenants, apparently yes. I walked to my kitchen window looking out at the garden. A hummingbird hovered near the tomato flowers. I need to think about this. "Dad, do not do anything crazy. Maybe just talk to them first." "Sure, honey. I will handle it." After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table and pulled out a folder I had not looked at in over a decade. Inside were the original development plans for Sunrise Ridge, documents from when the community was first established in 1998. I had been more than just an early resident here. I had been the engineer who designed the entire water system for the development. Back then, Henderson was growing rapidly, and developers were scrambling to build new communities in the desert. The company that developed Sunrise Ridge had faced a significant problem. The city water infrastructure ended about a mile away, and extending it would have cost millions. That is where I came in. My property, one of the first sold in the development, sat on top of an artesian well. When I bought the land, I negotiated a unique arrangement. I would allow the developer to use my well as the primary water source for the entire community. In exchange, I got my lot at a significant discount and retained ownership of the well and all associated water rights. The development would pay me a modest monthly fee for water access, and I would maintain the pumping station and filtration system located in a building on my property. This arrangement had worked smoothly for 15 years. The HOA, which took over from the original developer after the last lot sold in 2012, had continued making the monthly payments like clockwork. $2,000 per month went into my account every 30th of the month. It was not much compared to what I had earned as an engineer, but it covered my property taxes and utilities. I wondered if Deborah Patterson knew about this arrangement. She had moved into Sunrise Ridge only 3 years ago, buying one of the larger houses on the east side. She had been HOA president for 18 months, during which time she had instituted parking restrictions, banned basketball hoops visible from the street, and tried to force everyone to paint their houses in one of 3 approved colors. The next morning, I drove to the community center where the HOA maintained a small office. I found Deborah sitting at a desk, typing on a laptop. She was a woman in her early 50s, with blonde highlights and the kind of severe expression that suggested she enjoyed finding problems. "Gregory," she said, looking up, "I assume you received our letter." "I did. I want to discuss it." "There is nothing to discuss. The garden violates our covenants. It needs to go." She returned her attention to the laptop. "Deborah, that garden is not visible from any public area. It is in my backyard, maintained, clean, and productive. How does it detract from property values? Several neighbors have complained about the industrial appearance of the raised beds. This is a residential community, not a farm. Which neighbors? That information is confidential." I took a breath, trying to remain calm. "The covenants say nothing specifically prohibiting vegetable gardens. Your interpretation of aesthetic uniformity is subjective at best." Deborah closed her laptop and stood up. She was a tall woman, and she used her height to intimidate. The HOA board voted unanimously on this matter. The fine stands and the garden must be removed. If you wish to contest this decision, you may request a hearing, but I should warn you that legal fees will be added to your account if you lose." "I see." I stood there for a moment, considering my options. "Tell me, Deborah, do you know where the water for this development comes from?" She frowned. "The city water system, I assume." "No, it does not. Every drop of water used by the 230 homes in Sunrise Ridge comes from a well on my property. I own that well and all the associated water rights." Her expression did not change. "I am not sure what that has to do with your garden violation." "I am just making sure you understand the situation. That is all." I left before she could respond. I was angry, but more than that, I was disappointed. I had always believed in working within systems, finding reasonable solutions. But Deborah had made it clear she was not interested in reason. When I got home, I called my lawyer, Martin Chen. Martin had handled my wife's estate and various other legal matters over the years. I trusted him completely. "Greg, good to hear from you. What can I do for you?" I explained the situation with the HOA, the garden, and the fine. Then I told him about the water system. Martin was quiet for a moment. "Let me get this straight. You own the well that supplies water to the entire development, correct? I have all the original contracts and water rights documentation. And the HOA is aware of this." "The current president was not. I just informed her this morning." Martin laughed. "Oh, this is going to be interesting. Send me everything you have. All contracts, water rights documents, HOA covenants, everything. I want to review it all." I spent the afternoon scanning documents and emailing them to Martin. The original contracts were clear. I owned the well, the pump house, and all equipment. The development, now managed by the HOA, had rights to use the water in exchange for monthly payments, and with the understanding that I maintained operational control of the system. 3 days later, Martin called me back. "Greg, this is even better than I thought. According to the original agreement, you have the right to terminate water access with 90 days written notice. The development has no secondary water source. If you shut off that well, every home in Sunrise Ridge goes dry." "I do not want to actually shut off anyone's water, Martin. I just want them to leave my garden alone." "I understand, but sometimes the threat of action is more powerful than the action itself. Here is what I suggest." Martin outlined a strategy. First, I would formally request a hearing with the HOA board to contest the fine. At that hearing, I would present my case regarding the garden and remind them of our water arrangement. If they still refused to rescind the fine and the removal order, Martin would send a letter indicating that I was considering terminating the water access agreement. That might be too aggressive, I said. Greg, they fine you $500 for growing tomatoes. I think we can be a little aggressive. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening at the community center. I arrived 15 minutes early and found the meeting room already full. Apparently, word had spread that something interesting was about to happen. The HOA board consisted of 5 members. Deborah sat in the center, flanked by Richard Morrison, an accountant, Susan Young, a realtor, Carol Henderson, a retired teacher, and Mark Stevens, who owned a local insurance agency. They sat behind a long table at the front of the room, looking official and self-important. Deborah called the meeting to order and quickly ran through some routine business before getting to my case. Item 7 on our agenda is the appeal filed by Gregory Evers regarding a covenant violation and associated fine. Mr. Evers, you have 10 minutes to present your case. I stood and walked to the front of the room. About 40 residents sat in folding chairs, watching with interest. I recognized most of them, though I knew few well. I had kept to myself since my wife died. Thank you for hearing my appeal. As you know, I received a fine for maintaining a vegetable garden on my property. I believe this fine is unjustified for several reasons. First, the garden is located in my backyard, barely visible from any neighboring property and completely invisible from the street. Second, the garden is well maintained, attractive, and productive. Third, nowhere in our covenants is there a specific prohibition against vegetable gardens. The section cited in my violation letter refers to aesthetic uniformity, which is highly subjective. Deborah interrupted. We have photographs submitted by concerned neighbors showing the industrial appearance of your raised beds and the general disarray of the growing area. I would like to see those photographs. Deborah hesitated, then nodded to Richard, who pulled up images on a projector. The photos had clearly been taken with a telephoto lens, zoomed in to make the garden look more prominent than it actually appeared from ground level. One photo was angled to catch some tools I had left out after working on the beds. It was the only time I had left tools out, and someone had happened to photograph it. These photos are misleading, I said. They used telephoto lenses to exaggerate the appearance and were clearly taken by someone going out of their way to make the garden look problematic. Anyone who actually walks by my property sees something completely different. Susan Young spoke up. Mr. Evers, the issue is not whether the garden looks good from one angle or another. The issue is that this is a residential community with certain standards. If we allow vegetable gardens, what is next? Chicken coops, goat pens? That is a slippery slope argument and not based on what I am actually doing. I am growing vegetables, food, in neat, well-maintained raised beds. This harms nobody. Mark Stevens looked at his notes. The covenants give the HOA board broad discretion to determine what constitutes a violation of community standards. We voted, and we determined your garden violates those standards. That is within our authority. I could see this was going nowhere. They had made up their minds before I even walked in. I understand the board believes it has this authority, I said. Before you make your final decision, I think you should consider one additional factor. Deborah looked impatient. What factor is that? I own the well that supplies water to every home in this development. The water system is located on my property, and I have sole control over its operation. The HOA has rights to use that water under an agreement that can be terminated with 90 days' notice. The room went completely silent. Deborah's face lost color. Richard Morrison leaned forward. "Are you threatening to shut off our water over a garden?" "I am not threatening anything. I am reminding the board that we have a business relationship that extends beyond typical HOA matters. I am asking you to reconsider your position on my garden in light of the cooperative arrangement we have maintained for 15 years. Carol Henderson, who had been silent until now, spoke quietly. "Deborah, I think we should table this matter and consult with our attorney." "We do not need to consult with anyone," Deborah said, her voice tight. "Mr. Evers is clearly attempting to leverage an unrelated business arrangement to avoid complying with HOA rules. The fine stands." I looked at each board member. Carol seemed uncertain. Susan was scrolling through something on her phone, probably looking up information about the water system. Richard and Mark were looking at Deborah, waiting for her lead. "Then I guess we have nothing further to discuss," I said. "You will be hearing from my attorney." I left the meeting and drove home. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. I had never been good at confrontation. I liked solving problems through design and engineering, not arguments and threats. The next morning, Martin sent a formal letter to the HOA board. The letter was polite but clear. It stated that I was contesting the fine and the removal order on multiple grounds, including improper interpretation of the covenants, selective enforcement, and violation of my property rights. The letter then noted, almost as an aside, that given the adversarial stance the HOA had taken against me, I was reviewing all contracts and agreements between myself and the association, including the water access agreement. Martin called me after sending the letter. "That should get their attention. I expect you will hear from their attorney within 48 hours. It took 24 hours. The HOA's lawyer, a woman named Patricia Dunn, called me directly. "Mr. Evers, I represent the Sunrise Ridge HOA. I would like to discuss resolving this matter." "I am happy to discuss it. My position is simple: rescind the fine and leave my garden alone. The board believes the garden violates community covenants and sets a bad precedent. The board is wrong. The covenants are vague, and they are applying them selectively. I have lived here longer than any board member. I have never violated any reasonable rule. This is about Deborah Patterson flexing her authority, nothing more." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "Let me be frank with you. I have reviewed the water access agreement. You do have the right to terminate it, but doing so would cause significant hardship to hundreds of families. Surely you do not actually intend to shut off the water supply." "I do not want to shut off anything. I just want to grow vegetables in peace." "I understand your frustration, but you have to understand the board's position. They have to maintain standards or the whole system breaks down. Tell me, Patricia, you think my garden actually harms anyone or decreases property values?" She hesitated. "That is not really the point." "That is exactly the point. This is not about standards. This is about control, and I am not going to be bullied." We ended the call without resolution. Over the next week, I continued tending my garden while the bureaucratic machinery ground forward. The 14-day deadline to remove the garden came and went. The HOA added a $100 daily fine to my account. I ignored it. My daughter called frequently, worried. "Dad, this is getting out of hand. Maybe you should just remove the garden and plant it somewhere else." "Sarah, this is not really about the garden anymore. This is about principle." "I know, but you are talking about cutting off water to hundreds of people. That is extreme." "I am not going to actually do it, but they need to understand they cannot push people around." Meanwhile, word had spread through the neighborhood. I started receiving visits from other residents. Some supported me. Tom Bradley, who lived 3 houses down, stopped by one evening. "Greg, I just want you to know I think what the HOA is doing is garbage. I voted against Deborah in the last election. That woman has made living here miserable." Others were less supportive. Jennifer Walsh, who served on the Architectural Review Committee, left a note in my mailbox suggesting I was being selfish and unreasonable. The most interesting visit came from Robert Kane, an attorney who lived on the north side of the development. He knocked on my door on a Saturday morning. "Mr. Evers, I hope you do not mind me stopping by. I am Rob Kane. I live over on Sunset Court. I know who you are. What can I do for you? I have been following your situation with the HOA. I wonder if you have considered that other residents might want to join your cause." Join my cause. There are a lot of people frustrated with how the board operates. Deborah and her allies have been overreaching for months. Your situation has brought everything to a head. Some of us are talking about recalling the board. This was unexpected. I just want to keep my garden. I understand, but this is bigger than your garden now. The board has been citing vague covenant language to enforce all sorts of petty rules. Your case has made people realize we can push back. Robert left me with his phone number and a request to keep him informed. I was not sure how I felt about becoming the center of a neighborhood political movement. I just wanted to be left alone. 2 weeks after the hearing, the HOA board held an emergency meeting. This one was even more packed than the last. I arrived to find standing room only. The tension in the room was palpable. Deborah called the meeting to order, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "We have called this special session to address the ongoing situation with Mr. Evers and to clarify some misinformation that has been circulating in the community." She went on to explain the water system arrangement, though she got several details wrong. She emphasized that the HOA had every right to enforce covenants and that allowing my garden would open the floodgates to violations. Then, Susan Young made a motion to suspend the fine and removal order pending further review. Richard Morrison seconded it. Deborah looked shocked. "We already voted on this matter," Deborah said. "And we can vote again," Susan replied. "I have done research into our legal exposure. If Mr. Evers terminates the water agreement, this community faces a crisis. The cost of connecting to city water would be astronomical, likely requiring a special assessment of $20,000 per household. Maybe more." Residents murmured at this number. $20,000 was real money. Mark Stevens nodded. "I have to agree with Susan. We need to find a compromise here." "There is no compromise on standards," Deborah said, her voice rising. "We either enforce the covenants or we do not." Carol Henderson spoke up. "Deborah, the covenants do not specifically prohibit vegetable gardens." We made an interpretation, and maybe that interpretation was too aggressive. I am voting to suspend the fine. The vote was 4-1, with only Deborah voting to continue enforcement. The fine and removal order were suspended pending a full review of the covenant language and possible amendments. Deborah stood up, her face red. "This is a mistake. Mark my words, you are setting a precedent that will destroy this community." She walked out of the meeting. The remaining board members looked relieved. After the meeting, several residents came up to thank me. Tom Bradley shook my hand. That took guts, standing up to them like that. But I did not feel victorious. I felt tired. This whole situation had drained me. Over the next month, a committee was formed to review the HOA covenants and propose amendments. I was invited to join but declined. Robert Kane took a leadership role, along with several other residents who had their own grievances with the board's recent actions. During this time, Deborah became increasingly erratic. She sent long, rambling emails to all residents about the collapse of community standards. She showed up at properties looking for violations, measuring grass height and photographing any perceived infractions. Then things took a disturbing turn. One morning, I went to check on the pump house and found the door ajar. The lock had been broken. Inside, someone had tampered with the control panel. Wires had been cut, and the main circuit breaker had been switched off. I immediately called the police. An officer named Detective Sarah Martinez came to investigate. She took photos and dusted for fingerprints. "Any idea who might have done this?" she asked. "I have been in a dispute with the HOA president, but I cannot imagine she would do something like this. You would be surprised what people do in property disputes. We will investigate." I called my water system maintenance contractor, Bill Hughes, who came out the same day. He looked at the damage and shook his head. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. They cut specific wires that would shut down the system without causing permanent damage. "Can you fix it?" "Already fixed. But Greg, you need security out here. Cameras at minimum." I took his advice and installed a full security system that afternoon with cameras covering the pump house from multiple angles. 3 days later, it happened again. This time, the cameras caught everything. The footage showed Deborah Patterson arriving at 11:30 at night, using bolt cutters on the new lock I had installed, and entering the pump house. She spent 15 minutes inside before leaving. I called Detective Martinez immediately. She came out to review the footage. "That is pretty clear," she said. "That is breaking and entering, criminal mischief, and possibly sabotage of a utility. Given that this utility serves the entire community, this is serious. I want to press charges." "I understand. We will bring her in for questioning." The next morning, 2 police officers went to Deborah's house and arrested her. The story spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By afternoon, everyone knew that the HOA president had been arrested for sabotaging the community water system. The HOA board held another emergency meeting that evening. This time, Deborah was conspicuously absent. Susan Young, as vice president, ran the meeting. "In light of recent events, I am calling for a vote to remove Deborah Patterson as president and from the board entirely, pending the outcome of criminal charges against her." The vote was unanimous. Deborah was out. Susan continued. "I also want to formally apologize to Gregory Evers on behalf of the board. The way we handled his situation was wrong from the start. Greg, your garden is welcome here. We will be sending you a letter rescinding all fines and confirming that vegetable gardens are permitted under our covenants, provided they are maintained in reasonable condition." I stood up from my seat in the audience. "I appreciate that, Susan. I never wanted any of this. I just wanted to grow some tomatoes." The room erupted in applause. I felt my eyes getting wet and quickly sat back down. Over the following weeks, the legal process moved forward. Deborah was charged with criminal mischief, vandalism, and interfering with a utility service. Her attorney tried to argue that she was attempting to inspect equipment that served the community, but the video footage made her intent clear. She had deliberately damaged the system. In a plea agreement, Deborah pleaded guilty to misdemeanor criminal mischief and agreed to pay restitution for the damage and my security system costs. She was sentenced to 6 months probation, a $1,000 fine, and 100 hours of community service. She was also required to undergo anger management counseling. More importantly for the community, she was permanently banned from serving on the HOA board and from attending board meetings. The Covenant Review Committee, led by Robert Kane, spent 3 months revising the community rules. The new covenants were more specific and less open to interpretation. Vegetable gardens were explicitly permitted, provided they were maintained. The new rules also limited the HOA board's discretionary power and created a transparent appeals process for violations. The revised covenants passed with 87% approval in a community-wide vote. Susan Young took over as HOA president and brought a completely different approach to the role. She focused on actual community improvement rather than petty enforcement. The neighborhood felt different, more relaxed. One Saturday in late October, 6 months after the whole ordeal began, I was working in my garden when Tom Bradley walked over with his wife and 2 kids. "Greg, my kids have been learning about gardening in school. I was wondering if you might show them your setup. They are very interested in how you grow vegetables." I spent the next hour showing Tom's kids around the garden, explaining how raised beds work, the importance of soil quality, and how to tell when vegetables are ready to harvest. The kids were genuinely fascinated. As they were leaving, Tom's daughter, a bright 8-year-old named Emma, looked up at me. "Mr. Evers, do you think we could grow a garden like this?" "Absolutely. I could help you get started if you want." Tom smiled. "That would be great. I have been wanting to do something like this with the kids." Over the next few months, I helped 3 other families in the neighborhood start their own vegetable gardens. It became a small trend in Sunrise Ridge. The gardens added character to the community and gave neighbors something to talk about besides HOA drama. My daughter Sarah visited for Thanksgiving, and we harvested vegetables together from the garden that had caused so much trouble. "Dad, I have to admit, when you first told me you were going to fight the HOA over this, I thought you were being stubborn." "I was being stubborn. No, I mean stubborn in a bad way, but you were right. Sometimes you have to stand up for what matters, even over something as simple as a garden." "It was never really about the garden," I said, pulling up a particularly large carrot. "It was about not letting people push you around just because they have a little bit of authority." That evening, as I prepared Thanksgiving dinner using vegetables, herbs, and tomatoes from my garden, I reflected on everything that had happened. The confrontation with the HOA had been stressful and at times frightening. The sabotage had been downright criminal. But in the end, the community had come together. Bad leadership had been removed, and things had improved. I thought about the water system in my pump house, quietly running 24 hours a day, providing for hundreds of families. That system represented cooperation and mutual benefit. The same principles could apply to a community if people approached problems with good faith instead of rigid enforcement. The new HOA board, under Susan's leadership, maintained reasonable standards while respecting individual property rights. Grass was kept mowed, houses were maintained, but people had freedom to express themselves within sensible bounds. Some homes now had vegetable gardens. Others had flower gardens or xeriscaping. The diversity made the neighborhood more interesting, not less. In January, I received a formal letter from the HOA board. I opened it with some trepidation, old habits dying hard, but this letter was different. It was a thank you note for my 15 years of maintaining the water system and ensuring reliable service to the community. It included a small plaque that read, "Gregory Evers, in appreciation for dedicated service to Sunrise Ridge." Susan had signed it, along with all the board members. I hung the plaque in my pump house, next to the control panel and the security monitors that now kept watch over the equipment. Spring came, and I expanded my garden slightly, adding a section for melons and a trellis for climbing beans. Nobody complained. In fact, several neighbors stopped by to admire the setup and ask for advice on their own gardens. One afternoon in March, I was installing a new drip irrigation line when a car pulled up. I recognized Robert Kane getting out. "Greg, have you got a minute?" "Sure, what is going on?" Robert looked slightly uncomfortable. "The HOA board wants to formalize the water system arrangement. The current agreement is old, and we want to make sure everything is properly documented and that you are being fairly compensated for maintaining the system." "I am fine with the current arrangement. We know, but we want to do this right. We have had an independent company assess the value of the water you provide and the work you do maintaining the equipment. We would like to propose increasing your monthly fee from $2,000 to $3,500 with annual adjustments for inflation." I was stunned. "That is a significant increase. You are providing a critical service that would cost the community millions to replace. This is fair compensation, and honestly, it is probably still too low. We also want to establish a formal maintenance budget so you are not paying for repairs and upgrades out of pocket." We spent the next hour going over the details. The new agreement would be for 10 years, with options to renew. It included provisions for my eventual retirement or passing, ensuring the system could be transferred smoothly to professional management if needed. "There is one more thing," Robert said. "We want to create a small park area near the pump house, with a plaque explaining the history of the water system and your role in making this community possible. We think people should know this story." I felt emotion welling up. "That is not necessary." "Maybe not, but we want to do it anyway." The new agreement was signed in April. The increased income was substantial, but more meaningful was the respect it represented. The community valued what I provided and wanted to acknowledge it properly. The small park was completed in June. It featured a walking path, benches, and drought-resistant native plants. A bronze plaque told the story of how Sunrise Ridge was built around the artesian well on my property, and how the water system had sustained the community for nearly 2 decades. At the dedication ceremony, Susan Yang gave a short speech. "This park represents what our community should be about: cooperation, mutual respect, and appreciation for the people and resources that make our lives better." Gregory Evers could have walked away during our dispute. He could have shut off the water and made life very difficult for all of us. Instead, he stood his ground on principle, and in doing so, he made us all examine how we treat each other. There was applause, and several people came up to shake my hand afterward. It felt surreal. A year earlier, I had been a widower keeping to himself, tending a garden to cope with grief. Now I was being honored as a community benefactor, but the truth was simpler than that. I had just wanted to grow vegetables. Everything else had happened because I refused to accept an unjust fine from people who abused their authority. Deborah Patterson completed her probation without incident. I saw her once, several months after her sentencing, at a grocery store in Henderson. She saw me too and quickly turned down another aisle. I felt no satisfaction from her downfall. If anything, I felt sorry for her. She had let a small amount of power corrupt her judgment, and it had cost her reputation, money, and standing in the community. The criminal charges had been a wake-up call for HOA boards throughout Henderson. Several other communities reviewed their enforcement practices and toned down aggressive approaches. The local newspaper ran a story about HOA overreach, using Deborah's case as a cautionary tale. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. I maintained the water system, tended my expanded garden, and spent time helping neighbors with their own growing projects. I joined a local gardening club and even started teaching occasional workshops at the Henderson Library on desert vegetable gardening. My daughter Sarah visited more frequently, sometimes bringing her kids for weekend stays. They loved helping in the garden, getting dirty, and seeing where food actually comes from. My grandson, Tyler, became particularly interested in the water system. I would take him into the pump house and explain how the well, the pumps, and the filtration system worked together to provide clean water to hundreds of homes. "Grandpa, did you really almost shut off everyone's water?" he asked once. "I never wanted to shut off the water. I just needed people to understand that we all depend on each other. The community depends on me for water. I depend on the community for a place to live. When we forget that mutual dependence, we get into trouble." "But the HOA lady was mean to you." "Yes, she was. And she learned a hard lesson about consequences." 2 years after the initial confrontation, Susan Young decided not to run for re-election as HOA president. At the annual meeting, several people suggested I should run for the position. I politely declined. "I appreciate the confidence, but I am happy maintaining the water system and my garden. Leadership is not really my thing." Instead, Tom Bradley was elected president. He brought the same reasonable, collaborative approach that Susan had established. The HOA continued focusing on genuine community improvement rather than petty enforcement. One achievement I was particularly proud of was the community garden we established on a vacant lot the HOA owned near the east entrance to Sunrise Ridge. 20 families participated, each maintaining their own plot. The garden became a gathering place, somewhere neighbors could meet, share tips, and build relationships. I donated seedlings from my garden to help people get started, and I volunteered to teach basic gardening skills to anyone interested. The community garden thrived, producing vegetables, herbs, and flowers. More importantly, it produced friendships and a sense of shared purpose. In the 3rd year after the dispute, the HOA board approached me about writing a history of Sunrise Ridge for the community newsletter. They wanted to document how the development was built, the unique water system arrangement, and the lessons learned from our governance challenges. I worked on the history for several months, digging through old records and interviewing longtime residents. The resulting document was 15 pages long and included photographs of the development at various stages, technical diagrams of the water system, and copies of the original agreements that made everything possible. The history was well received. Several residents told me they had never known the backstory of their community. Understanding where the water came from and how the development had evolved gave them a deeper appreciation for where they lived. As I entered my 4th year post-retirement, I found myself more connected to the community than I had ever been when I was working full-time. The garden that had caused so much trouble had become a symbol of individual rights balanced with community responsibility. I thought often about what would have happened if I had simply given in to the original fine and removal order. My garden would be gone, and Deborah would still be HOA president, likely making life miserable for other residents over other petty issues. By standing firm, I had inadvertently triggered changes that improved the entire community. The water system continued running smoothly. I had trained a backup operator, a younger neighbor named Chris, who was studying civil engineering. He helped me with routine maintenance and was learning how the system worked. Eventually, when I could no longer manage the physical demands of maintaining the equipment, Chris would be ready to take over. On the 5th anniversary of the day I received that first violation letter, I held a garden party. I invited everyone in Sunrise Ridge, expecting maybe 20 or 30 people to show up. Over 100 came. People brought dishes made from vegetables grown in their own gardens. We set up tables under shade tents in my backyard, and neighbors mingled, ate, and shared stories. Tom Bradley made a toast. 5 years ago, Greg received a ridiculous fine for this beautiful garden. That find led to a community awakening. We realized we had let our HOA become more about control than community. Today, we celebrate not just Greg's garden, but the spirit of cooperation and respect that now defines Sunrise Ridge. Thank you, Greg, for refusing to back down. Everyone raised their glasses. I felt overwhelmed by the support and affection from people who had been strangers just a few years earlier. Sarah pulled me aside during the party. "Dad, I am proud of you. Mom would be proud too. You turned something negative into something that brought people together." "I just wanted to grow tomatoes," I said, smiling. "You grew a lot more than that." As the sun set over the Nevada desert and my neighbors enjoyed food, conversation, and community in my backyard, I looked at the rows of vegetables that had started everything. The tomato plants were heavy with fruit. The pepper plants were thriving in the heat. The squash vines were spreading exactly as they should. Beyond the garden, I could hear the quiet hum of the pump house, steadily moving water from deep underground to every home in the development. That sound had been the background music of my life for 15 years. It represented continuity, service, and the interconnection that makes communities possible. The legal aftermath of Deborah's arrest had long since concluded. Her probation had ended, and she had moved away from Sunrise Ridge, finding a fresh start in another part of Henderson. The community had moved on, wiser and more careful about who it elected to positions of authority. The new covenants had been working well. There had been a few minor disputes, but nothing like the rigid enforcement of the Deborah era. The appeals process had been used several times, and in each case, reasonable compromises were reached without threats or fines. I had learned something profound through the whole experience. Power dynamics in small communities can be just as complex and consequential as those in larger organizations. The person who controls essential resources has leverage, whether they want it or not. I had not sought that leverage. It had come with my property, negotiated years before I ever imagined needing it. But when push came to shove, that leverage had protected me from unjust treatment. It had also protected the community from continued bad governance. Sometimes, the threat of consequences is what brings people to the bargaining table. I never enjoyed wielding that power. The thought of actually shutting off water to families, including children and elderly residents, made me sick. But the threat had been necessary to get attention and force a resolution. It was a reminder that peaceful people still need to be capable of defending their rights. As my garden party wound down and neighbors began heading home, I found myself standing alone near the raised beds where this all started. The vegetable garden was bigger now, more productive, but fundamentally the same as when Deborah first decided it was a problem. I thought about alternative timelines. What if I had paid the fine and removed the garden? What if I had never mentioned the water system? What if Deborah had been reasonable and we had worked out a compromise early on? But those were not the paths we took. Instead, we had confrontation, escalation, criminal behavior, arrests, and eventually, resolution and reform. It was messy and stressful, but it led to genuine improvement. The community was stronger now, more transparent, more fair, more connected. And I had friends where before I had only acquaintances and isolation. My garden had given me purpose after my wife's death. Fighting for it had given me renewed connection to the world. Sometimes the things we struggle for become more valuable because of the struggle itself. I walked to the pump house as the last guests departed. The security cameras I had installed after the sabotage were still there, now more for insurance purposes than real security concerns. The equipment hummed along, digital displays showing pressure, flow rate, and water quality. Everything was running perfectly. I thought about the hundreds of families taking showers, washing dishes, watering their own gardens, all drawing from the well beneath my property. This system, which I had helped design nearly 20 years ago, had become the literal lifeblood of the community. And that community had, in turn, given me a reason to keep going after loss. Life had a way of creating these interdependencies, these mutual needs that bound people together whether they realized it or not. As I locked the pump house and walked back to my home under a sky full of stars, I felt at peace. The tomatoes would need harvesting tomorrow. The irrigation system would need a minor adjustment. Chris was stopping by on Thursday to learn about the filtration backwash procedure. Life would continue, one day at a time, with purpose and connection. The certified letter that had arrived on that hot Tuesday afternoon 5 years ago was now just a document in a file, a reminder of how things can spiral out of control and then find resolution. The fine had never been paid. The garden had never been removed. And the water continued flowing as it always had, sustaining life in the desert.